Thanks for everybody for coming. I'll just go through a few key points and then we can focus our time in whatever aspects you want. I think originally you asked me to talk specifically about office, but if anybody wants me to talk about the impact, whether it's retail or industrial, something like that, we can do that as well. It's just slightly different. So I just thought this was interesting. I came across this quote from Theodore Roosevelt. Every person who invests in well-selected real estate in a growing section of a prosperous community adopts the surest and safest method of becoming independent, for real estate is the basis of wealth. Theodore Roosevelt. And then I'll touch on the second one, but just you've probably heard before, but a lot of people say McDonald's isn't a fast food company, they're a real estate company, right? Because they, for the most part, about 85% of their locations, they own the real estate, and then they lease it to their franchisee. So they're making money on that, yeah. So what we're talking about today is just looking at a scenario where you're looking at either a purchase, owning the property, or leasing it, and what are some of the benefits of each of those and some of the downsides. So first we'll touch base on the economic considerations. So one is upfront cost. So owning typically requires a down payment. If you're an owner user, which means you're going to be occupying the real estate for your business, the bank refers to you as usually an owner user, and that's usually just a little bit safer for the bank. And so they'll be more aggressive with terms and then also lower down payment. SBA, you can typically do 10% down with certain programs. Some banks do 15%. If you're buying investment property right now, it's typically requiring a 35-40% down payment. Sometimes as low as 25, it depends on the borrower and the property. So one big consideration though is if you're gonna buy, if you're gonna buy $1 million property and you need to come up with 10% down, that's $100,000. If you have $100,000 or can get it, great. If not, then you might be focused more on the lease. So as far as upfront cost, a lease would be more beneficial because you just have typically a security deposit, and then whatever you're going to do in the way of tenant improvements to the building, often the landlord does some of those for you. Sometimes you're doing some of them yourself.
So can you touch on the lease if business owners, typically why would they want to go into the office? Because it's the U.S. economy right now is 35% to 40% fragmented economy or gig economy, and people work from home. Mm-hmm. Why would you want to go to an office building or just a commercial building?
Yeah, so it depends on the business. If you're an attorney or a CPA, you could work from your home, but typically they would have an office somewhere, or if you have staff. So let's say you're an accounting firm and you've got 15 employees, then you might need about 3,000 or 4,000 feet of office space, and you could probably lease that somewhere, or you could purchase it and then occupy the space yourself.
So what are you seeing business going in the future? It's a lot of, like I said, everything's all...
It really varies, yeah. Yeah, so just like with home ownership, it used to be if you were renting a house, someone would wonder what was wrong with you. Are you in transition? Are you new to the area? Are you thinking of leaving soon? Otherwise, why wouldn't you own? And now what we've gone through in the last 10 years or so, people all of a sudden don't think it's bad to rent, right? Because there's more flexibility and things. So some of those same things apply to commercial real estate as well. Okay. Yeah. So one issue is the upfront cost. The other is the monthly expense. So on upfront cost, the lease option would be favorable because it's going to require less money upfront. If somebody has money to invest and they would want to put it into the real estate instead of, stocks and bonds and that sort of thing, they could do that as well. So some people would prefer to do the down payment. As far as monthly costs, almost always the ownership is going to be lower cost. And the example I've provided here kind of goes through just what a typical lease first own scenario would be. But in general, the monthly cost for a purchase, even if you count some sort of return on your down payment, is almost always going to be less on the purchase versus the lease. And part of the reason is you're usually able to lock in an interest rate for 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. And that helps you keep that payment constant, whereas with a lease, you're almost always going to have some sort of annual increases. So if you start out with your rent the first year at 10 grand a month, next year it'll probably go up 2-3% a year. And that'll just keep happening over time. Whereas if you own the property, you're just controlling it with your loan payment. So almost always, I don't think I've ever seen an own versus lease analysis from a lender that shows that the cost is less to lease, right? And that's just kind of the way the numbers work out. Then there's tax benefits. So tax benefits, believe it or not, actually favor the lease as it relates to the business, because you're able to write off all of your rent and then all of your operating expenses. So if you're on a triple net lease where the tenant's paying taxes, insurance, utilities, that's part of the rent. So you've got that with your ownership. On the ownership, you can write off the interest expense, which is part of your payment. That's an actual expense in your operating expenses. But then you also get depreciation, and we'll get to that in a minute on this analysis. But that's a paper loss, right? It's not a true cost to you, but you're able to deduct it on your taxes, and that helps.
Can you focus on the triple net? I think a lot of
Sure.
people here at the university, especially the undergrads, they think that it's like renting an apartment and you just...
Everything's included?
Everything's included. Can you talk a
Sure.
little about triple net?
So one way to lease space would be to have it be a full service lease where the landlord's going to pay for all the expenses. So the taxes, the insurance, common area maintenance, utilities, janitorial. So that's full service. The landlord's paying for all the cost. You as a tenant just pay your rent, and then phone and data typically are extra. And then a triple net lease is set up where the tenant's paying those operating expenses. So in a full service example, let's say the rent's $30 a foot per year, and of that $30, $10 a foot is operating expenses. On a full service lease, the landlord's paying all the operating expenses and the tenant pays the landlord $30 a foot. Thank you, Thomas. On a triple net lease, the tenant would pay $20 a foot plus triple nets. And those triple nets, the three ends, the big categories are taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. So everything that's not taxes, insurance, gets lumped into common area maintenance. It's not just the maintenance, but it's utilities, janitorial, everything. And then as those expenses go up each year, whatever those true expenses are, the tenant just pays that.
So the tenant have to realize that, expect an increase, and don't assume that the rent's going to be constant for...
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
they have to build that into their cash.
They have that built in, right.
Okay.
And you could try and tell a landlord, well, I think historically inflation's only been 1.5% or 2% a year. It kind of doesn't matter. They want to keep up with the market, and typically that'll be about 3% a year.
Okay.
Yeah. And then finally, investment returns. So on the ownership scenario, you're going to get principal reduction. So part of your payment each month to the bank, part of it's interest, and the rest is principal reduction. So over time, you're building equity in your property. Just like with your home, over time you're paying down your loan, and the same as in real estate. So when we look at a purchase scenario for a client, if they hold a property for 10 years, at the end of that 10 years, they're going to owe significantly less, and that's actual cash in their pocket when they sell or when they refinance.
So from your personal experience, there's a debate between investing in the market and actually buying real estate. I mean, what have you seen from clients and personal experience? Who has a better return? The people with a heavy real estate portfolio or stock portfolio?
Well, it depends, right? There was a time when we would ask clients, what kind of return do you want in your investment real estate? And they'd say, how about 25% a year? Because that's what I'm getting in the stock market. And that's just not feasible, right?
Right.
But then when stocks were going to zero, we could say, hey, what if you have an investment that doesn't ever go up in value, but doesn't ever go to zero? Mm-hmm. And they say, oh, that looks pretty good. So, yeah. So I would say it depends client by client. Most clients have a bias towards leasing or buying. And it's very rare that they're indifferent on it. But it's possible. But typically there's either they're it doesn't have to do with the economics, it has to do with other things. So maybe they're starting out and they do have $100,000, but instead of putting it down on a building, they'd rather hire more employees or put it in advertising or do things to grow their business. And that's their biggest return. Usually when people are leasing space, considering buying, when they go from leasing to buying, it's because their business is fairly stable. And so they know they're going to have about 3,000 feet or 5,000 feet for the foreseeable future. And they've been paying rent for a while, and they say, hey, why don't I pay myself instead of the landlord?
Right.
Yeah.
So have you seen the Tenant of Commons? Is it still around? I remember a few years back that used to be the big thing, the Tenants of Commons.
That was kind of a fad for a while, and you see it occasionally, but not as much.
Okay.
And that's simply if part of the reason people were doing it is so they could do a 1031 exchange.
Right.
So if Thomas and I own a property together, 50-50 partners, and we have an LLC, and we sell it, we have to do a 1031 exchange, we'd have to have that LLC buy the replacement property. But if you and I owned the property as tenants in common, then we could sell it, and you could go buy one property, and I could go buy another, and that would work.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, they used to be real big.
Yeah.
Now it's like, we don't hear too much.
We don't hear too much about it. And the issue is the tenants in common, it was more like an investment, almost like investing in a REIT, is the way the investors looked at it. So there was a building in downtown Tacoma that I think it had 250 or 300 TIC, tenant in common investors in it. But then you're still relying on a managing partner to manage it and things, and it just didn't work very well. Yeah, so we don't see that as often anymore. So on the investment return, if you buy, you're going to have your principal reduction, and then you're also getting appreciation. So just like with a home, if you buy a house for $500,000 and you put down, say 10% even, you're getting appreciation in the whole $500,000, not just your 10% down. So likewise with commercial real estate, you're getting appreciation in the total property rather than just your down payment, and that leverage is what's creating the returns for the investment or the ownership side. And as long as the return on that property is higher than your interest rate, which it typically is, then you're getting positive leverage. So if you can borrow money from Columbia Bank at 5%, and you're getting a 7% return on your building based on the rent you would pay yourself, then that's positive leverage. That's a good thing.
Right.
Yeah. On a lease, your decision might be impacted by alternative investments. So if you're owning a business and you're a stockbroker, and you know for a fact that you can put that money to work and get a 12 or 15% return, that might impact your decision on whether or not you want to buy versus lease, because again, your alternative investment is a significantly higher return maybe than the real estate. Okay. So then the next section is alternative investments, and really here, this is what, for the most part, this is what it comes down to for most people that are looking to either buy or rent. So it's the impact on their core business. So if somebody has a business accounting firm and they want to grow it, they might want an ability to lease 3,000 feet today, and in a couple of years lease 5,000 and so forth and grow. Or they might want to do a new branch in Seattle or Bellevue or Spokane or Boise, Idaho. And so that flexibility with leasing is usually better. So impact on the core business. Sometimes people get focused, because we've all kind of learned that owning real estate is good, they get focused on the fact that they need to own it, when in fact, if that's not in alignment with their core business, maybe they're better off leasing. Right? So Columbia Bank, as an example, would often own branches they occupy, but they lease space in downtown Tacoma in a large building, and they could own that if they wanted to, but they don't need to. Yeah. Oh, I didn't know that. Well, way to go. So flexibility with the space to shrink or grow, we touched on that a little bit. If you buy a 10,000 foot office building and you occupy the whole thing, then that works well when you're 10,000 feet. But if you need to lay off some people or you change your business model and you don't need all that space, then you've got vacancy and you need to fill it with maybe another tenant, which you could do. Or if you need to grow and now you need 15,000 feet, you could always add onto your building, but that's not as easy. Doesn't provide as much flexibility. So owning would probably be less flexible for most people, and leasing would be more flexible. With a lease, you can negotiate terms for an option to renew. So you can make a 5-year commitment to lease and have an option to renew for 5 years. So now you control that space for 10 years, but you're only making a commitment for 5 years. Whereas with ownership, you're having to commit pretty significantly to the space to buy it.
Plus, there's a cost to it too, because if something happens to the building, like a pipe breaks, I mean, you're, as the owner, you're responsible for that. Then a new code that comes out that you need seismic proofing and new.
That's true.
Whatever it is.
Yeah. I would say that typically, as believe it or not, it hits you differently as the owner. It hits you directly, but as a tenant, you're still paying for all of that. It's just kind of lumped into your rent.
Right. It's hidden somewhere.
Yeah, it's kind of hidden. It's not as painful that way, yeah. And then as far as flexibility, it depends on the lease term, but if you sign a 5-year lease and in 2 years you decide that space isn't big enough for you or it's too big and you need to leave, the landlord still wants rent for that next 3 years, right? And so you have a commitment, an obligation for that, just like if you sign on a loan for a car. If the car's not worth anything in 2 years, it doesn't matter, the bank still wants the rest of their payments. So on a lease, you can sublease to a different tenant to try and get out from under your liability, and that can save you money, but there's a cost and a risk associated with that. If you're the owner, again, most people would think of ownership as being less liquid because now you have to go and sell the property. But at least if in 2 years you decide you don't need that building, you can sell it and recover your money. Whereas on a sublease, sometimes that takes a while. You might be sitting on it for a year or two. And so in some ways, ownership might provide actually better flexibility. It's not as liquid, right? But again, with that lease obligation, if you decide you've outgrown your space, you can't just say to the landlord, I don't want to pay rent anymore. Yeah.
Now, from a legal standpoint, with a business that they sign a lease, as in regards to negotiating with the landlord, should the tenant negotiate that you can sublease? Because sometimes you can't sublease.
Yeah, my understanding is that subleasing is a right you have as a tenant.
Okay.
Yeah.
Really?
The landlord can control it, and it depends on what the lease says. So the lease might say the landlord won't withhold approval unreasonably withhold approval. Sometimes, so if you have an accounting company and you want to lease to another accounting company or a law firm, they'll say no problem. If you say, hey, I want to put a bar in this space, they'd say, well, wait a second, that doesn't fit the building, right? So, but you do have a right to sublease.
Okay.
Yeah. But there's just a cost associated with it and timing.
Now, if you go to court and you still have 4 years left on your lease, I mean, the landlord can ask for those 4-year lease, remaining.
Yep. And if you default on your lease, then there's provisions in your lease that give the landlord certain protections, provisions of default, and so they can accelerate the payments and you owe everything. And then the landlord has a right to mitigate, has an obligation to mitigate that. So they'd have to find a new tenant for it. But however long that takes and the cost, the leasing commissions and things to find the new tenant, that all falls back to you as the tenant.
Can you talk about landlord subordination agreement? I know banks try to do deals and you have a tenant in there, but the bank's trying to, worst case scenario, trying to get their collateral back, but the verbiage on the bank document is so hostile. Why is it so difficult for landlords to sign off on it?
That's a good lender question. Subordinations? Typically, we don't see it be a problem. The lender just wants to know that because, let's say we've got a building with 5 different tenants in it. and they have priority. The landlord has signed leases with those tenants. They have priority over that new loan. So the lender wants to be in first position. So they ask those tenants to subordinate to the new loan. Subordination in a tournament typically. And that doesn't mean the lender can just wipe those tenants out and their leases are invalid.
Right.
It just means they're subordinate to that loan. Yeah.
Just in case they default on our loan, and we have to go in there and get the equipment or
Yeah.
repossess.
Yeah, so basically the bank,
collateral.
yeah,
We're
yeah,
asking permission from the landlord to allow us to do that.
yeah.
But some landlords are they just don't want to
They
sign.
they don't want to sign.
Yeah,
I don't know why.
yeah,
I'm just
yeah.
looking for my banking.
It's typically a non-negotiable thing, yeah,
Right,
the lender requires it, just like assignment of leases. If a bank's gonna do a loan on a property and you've got rents coming in, as long as you're making your payment, you can keep getting those rents, but if you stop making your payments, then the bank has a right to sweep the account and collect those rents to make the payments.
Right.
Yeah,
Right of offset.
yeah, exactly, well said, yeah. So that's kind of the flexibility with the space to shrink or grow. Again, in general, leasing provides more flexibility, but not in all circumstances. And then control of the building. So if you're a tenant in the building, you have certain rights. You might have right to have a sign on the building. You have a right to occupy your space. But if you're the owner of the building and you want to significantly you decide in a couple of years you want to change the image of your company and you want to significantly upgrade the image of the building, if you're the owner of the building, you can do that. If you're a tenant, you don't have that right. So control would definitely be better if you're a owner than if you're a tenant. Okay, and then timing. That's one of the biggest issues. So if you're needing a space and you say, I need a space in Tacoma, I need 5,000 feet, and all we can commit to with our business plan is 3 years, then that probably looks more like a lease, right? Because that's probably a better fit. If you say, I'm a dentist, I'm going to invest heavily in this space, I'm going to sign at least a 10-year lease, and I'm going to have to do significant improvements in this space, then you're probably looking at a 10-year lease term. And at that point, that's not much different than if you were to buy a building. So in general, this doesn't work across the board, but just in general, if you looked at buying a property and the total cost, or making lease payments on that building over a 10-year period, the lease payments would typically be higher than the actual cost of the building. Yeah.
It's just overcoming that down payment part.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the problem.
Yeah. So these considerations,
What
then,
about lease with options to buy scenarios? Have you seen any of those recently in Tacoma?
yeah, we see them occasionally. Yeah, and it's not a bad way to go. So basically, the landlord's trying to incentivize the tenant to come into a building, saying, "Hey, I'll lease it to you now, but I'll give you possibly an option to buy at a fixed set time or period and price, or a right of first refusal." That's more common. So I know, Mr. Landlord, you don't want to sell the building today, but if you ever do down the road change your mind, I want first crack at it. Or a right of first refusal if you get an offer from somebody else, I want the right to buy it at that price. It's no real loss to the landlord, and it gives the tenant additional incentive.
What
So-
about private party transaction? Have you seen that?
Seller financing?
Yeah, seller financing.
Yeah, yeah, we actually see that quite a bit. We've got a client right now that's selling a building, and he would rather not, he owns it free and clear, and his basis is pretty low, so he'd rather not get a big chunk of money and have to go invest it. He'd rather get just a minimal down payment, and he'll have to pay capital gains on a portion of that, proportionately based on the purchase price, but then he gets monthly payments, and that's really what he wants.
Right. It's annuity.
Yeah, it's annuity, exactly, and that's what he'd prefer.
Yeah. So do you help with that? Does your firm help with that transaction, or is it just a
We
private?
would typically get an attorney involved,
Right.
and attorneys are involved in most of our transactions because they're the ones that can craft the language to do what either the landlord or the tenant wants, or the buyer or the seller wants. Yeah, yeah, and they look out for all the pitfalls that we don't think of.
And
Yeah.
you use big words we don't understand.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so what I thought we'd do is just go through this ownership versus lease, are we good on time so far?
Oh, yeah, we're good,
Okay.
yeah.
So on this page, we've got an example, and this is an industrial building, so the rents might look a little off, but that's why. But the way it works is the same, whether it's office or retail industrial. So if we were going to buy a 33,000 foot building and pay about 3.9 million for it, have some improvements, the lender fee, some closing costs, total cost would be about 4.2 million, and we'd have to come up with 424,000. Okay? Everybody with me there?
Yeah.
And if we lease that space, our upfront costs would be about 121, which is a security deposit, and then maybe some tenant improvements that we do to the building. So you'll notice there's the improvements are 100,000 versus 200 on the purchase, but that just, so roughly you're comparing a $400,000 upfront cost to 120. Pretty significant
So
difference.
who does it, so the owner of the building will provide a $100,000 TI?
Well, in this example, the tenant's doing that. So the tenants, because the tenant's going into a space, maybe it's not quite what they need and they need to add some power or they need to add some additional offices. So that's a cost that they're incurring. So the upfront costs are significantly more on the ownership. The monthly costs, you'll notice, are quite a bit less for the purchase. You've got a mortgage payment with interest, principal and interest. You've got operating expenses, property taxes, and so your total monthly is just over $29,000. And if the tenant was paying rent, the lease payments would be about $21,000 and operating expenses about $15,000. So total is about $36,000. So that's just a market rent based on the value of that building. Okay, so kind of apples to apples. So the monthly cost you'll see is quite a bit less on the purchase. If on that purchase, that borrower, new owner, was able to lock in a rate with the bank for 10 years fixed, then the operating expenses and taxes will go up each year, but that principal and interest mortgage payment will stay flat for the full 10 years. And on the lease, those lease payments every year will go up, likely. Okay? So then when you look at the monthly ownership benefits, on the ownership side, we've got depreciation, operating expense deduction, property tax deduction, interest deduction, and then here they just used 1% appreciation on the asset, which is very low. Typically, we'd see 3 to 5% appreciation a year. So that's I would say that's a fairly conservative number, 1% increase in value each year. And so the total effective monthly cost is just over $17,000, okay? And then on the lease, you don't have depreciation, but you have a much higher lease deduction and operating expense deduction. And so your total, the lease benefits you'll notice are just over $14,000, and on the ownership side it's only just over $12,000, but the total cost, effective cost on the lease is $22,000 versus $17,000. So it's cheaper to buy.
Yep.
And then we've got effective the ownership analysis. You've got the annual effective cost difference, the principal pay down. We talked about that before. When you're making your loan payments, you're paying down the principal each month. And then over 15 years, that's $2.7 million. So if you're comfortable making a 15-year commitment, in this example, without bringing everything else into it, it would make far more sense to buy than it would to lease. That's that wealth accumulation.
Mm-hmm. It's not bad money on a
Yeah.
conservative basis.
Yeah.
1% appreciation.
Yeah. So again, these other factors really play into it. It's not just the economics, because the economics will almost always favor ownership over leasing. Yeah, because if the market's kind of slow and lease rates are lower, probably property values are also going to be a little bit lower. If lease rates are very high, like downtown Seattle, lease rates are very high, purchase is going to also be very high too, right? Values are going to be higher based on that rent. So those pretty much go hand in hand, lockstep.
So we're kind of like old guys. We've survived the recession, the real estate. You know, I know that during that time, you know, there was a lot of concessions, you know, lease negotiation and
Yep.
reducing this, reducing that. And my question to you, John, is that from your experience, even though we had a bad economy and it always comes and goes, do you always see real estate always recovers and we always go back to normal?
Yes. Yeah. If-
Always?
never say never, never say always. But yes.
Yes.
But yes. Yeah.
Most of the time they do.
And-
Yes, with asterisk.
Over time, yeah,
Because of that.
yeah. And we're lucky, of course, being in the Pacific Northwest, right? Because we have no end in sight to the population growth in our area, both the Puget Sound and also Pierce County. Pierce County is growing faster than King County percentage-wise because there's more room to grow.
Right.
So we're growing as a percentage faster in Pierce County, and we will for the next 10 years. So all those additional people here mean there's more demand and more need for services, and that's all very positive. So in our area, we're very fortunate that we have that working for us. If we were maybe at a town in the Midwest that was very isolated and very dependent on a certain business or industry, and that industry went away, then you might see real estate values stay flat for a long time or go down. There just wouldn't be any demand. But here, we have momentary blips, just like with housing. For a while, it looked like housing couldn't get any higher, and then it fell off the cliff,
Right.
and now prices are back above that. Yeah, so over time, it will almost always go higher. And so that as long as you can wait, just like with a home, even if you're buying a home, let's say you bought a home last year at the peak, or maybe this year's the peak, and it goes down a little bit, as long as you don't have to sell, no problem, because you can, as long as you can wait a few years, it'll come back. Yeah.
So it sounds like real estate is almost like a long game. You just got to ride it out a little bit. If you try to flip it, then you've really got to play out almost like the market a little bit with rates.
Yeah, that's true, and there's just a number of ways to slice it. The other way you could do it is, you could, let's say you were a law firm and you needed about 10,000 feet, and the value in a building with the income is the tenancy, right? That's where the value is. So what if you bought an empty building for a discount because it's empty?
Right.
And then you put your law firm in it, and you do a lease with your law firm at a rate that significantly increases the value of the building.
Right.
You could sell the building, you still have your lease in place, and now you've put money in your pocket by just adding the tenancy to that building. Or maybe you have a partner buy the building with you and they come up with the equity, you bring the tenancy, and then you get the increase that way. So just a few more considerations. One question is, how does this decision support your core business? So again, the focus, if you're a business needing real estate, what is that? That's really your focus, right? You don't want the real estate to get in the way of it, to hinder that business. You want it to support it. So as long as that decision to buy or to lease supports your core business, great. If it doesn't, then you have to make some other considerations. There's before and after tax costs, but you almost always want to look at your after tax costs because that's the true implication to you. And if you do that, that's where depreciation and some of those things come into play as well. And then finally, exit strategy. So again, it might seem like a lease on a short-term basis gives you the most flexibility, but if you were to sign a 5-year lease and a year into it, you decide you don't need the space, you've got 4 years left, that might not be any easier than if you were to buy the building and have closing costs with a sale.
Right.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I got a lot of questions. And I asked this mostly because some of the students will listen to it, your talk here. We kind of talked in class about cap rates and, where does this thing come from? I mean, it seems
Sure.
like, we have a 5%, 6.5%, and I mean, where, is there like the Wall Street Journal Prime is kind of set for everybody, or how's that work?
It's just really based on the market. So, as an example, we were talking earlier about apartment complexes. A cap rate is simply capitalization rate. So if you paid all cash for an investment, what is the rate of return on that? So if I buy a $1 million property and I have a 5% cap rate, then that's going to give me $50,000 a year return. So if with apartments, people are willing to take a lower return based on the current income because in general, apartment rents are going up significantly. So instead of having a tenant locked into a 5 or 10 year lease term with fixed increases, a buyer of an apartment complex might see the ability to, in 6 or 12 months, raise everybody's rent 15%. So they're buying based on the cap rate, the current return on the current rents, but their focus is on the future rents, which will be higher. So I might buy a property at a 4 cap, but I know that in 2 years it'll be an 8 cap.
Right.
So that's why you're seeing people willing to buy at such low returns. If, especially if the financing is say at 5% and you're buying at a 4 cap, that doesn't work, right? You have negative leverage, but it's because you can get that rent going up.
Right.
And in general, just like with our stock investments, the safer an investment and the more desirable, the lower the return. So if I buy Microsoft and everybody's liking Microsoft, I'm going to pay a premium for that stability and that income growth. Or a stock, say with a dividend. If I buy a penny stock or a startup tech stock, I might get 15, 20% return per year, but it also might go to zero risk reward.
Right.
So in general, the nicer a property, the better quality of the property, the better quality of the tenant, the lower the return is going to be, the more risk involved, shorter lease terms, shaky tenant, building in bad disrepair, then the higher the return is going to be.
Right. Because you're doing capital improvements to improve that
And lift it.
and live there and raise the rents. And,
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Yeah, good question.
It's really dependent on what kind of headaches you want.
Yeah, exactly. So in general, and there is a correlation between interest rates and cap rates.
Mm-hmm.
So there's usually a spread as when interest rates were, say, 7%, then cap rates were often 7.5%, 8%. And then as interest rates got lower and lower, people said, gosh, if I can borrow at 4%, I could buy a building with a 5% cap,
Right.
and I'm still in good shape.
Right.
And we would say, well, what about when in 5 or 7 years that interest rate, you have to refinance, what are rates going to be then? And they
Right.
said, well, let's not worry about it today.
Yeah, cross that bridge when we get to it.
Yeah.
So I'm always, been in this lending game. I always have this headache over fair market value, because if you and I agree, this is the price we have to pay, then we go to a bank and we have to get a third party. That third party comes in and says, well, you're all wrong. This is what I come up with. Can you talk a little bit about fair market value and the frustrations that you see in your industry as comps and where they're coming up with this idea? Because, we're doing deals at Tacoma, but they're getting comps up in Seattle and Thurston County, and it's just like
Sure.
nothing.
Apples and oranges.
Yeah,
Yeah.
pickup trucks, right?
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
It is an apple. It's like-
Yeah, and the banks might have a little bit different perspective on it, but obviously the appraiser is there to provide a level of security for the lender.
Right.
And so they're looking at it on the most conservative approach, hopefully, a fair approach, but more conservative, because they want to err on the side of caution. And typically it makes it harder for the appraisers if the market's stable and with just moderate growth, then that's fairly easy because you can look at sales comps or rent comps from the last 6 months or 12 months and base your decision on that. Right now, though, if the economy and the market's declining, then those lease comps and sale comps from 12 months ago will be invalid, right? Because it'll show, maybe a sales comp will show that the building sold for $250 a foot, but 12 months later it's only selling for $185 a foot because the market's much lower. Likewise, when things are going really well, as they have been for so long, it's hard for the appraisers because the comps they're getting for leasing or sales are showing one thing, but now we know they're higher. With apartments, that makes it incredibly difficult because rents keep going up and up and up. Yeah. So there is, sometimes there can be a disparity that way. But typically the appraisals will look at different ways of appraising the property and then come up with you know, a solution that gives us a value. I haven't had a deal I've lost because of an appraisal. I've had deals that were made more difficult or we had to make some changes, but yeah.
What are you seeing in the market regarding, I can't say this word very well, condominialize, when they convert?
Condominiumize?
Condominiumize.
Yeah.
Just be simple, Smith. That's
Yeah.
Yeah, have you seen that lately, or has it kind of gone away?
No, we see it. So what we were saying earlier with lease versus buy, so if you're a CPA firm and you need 3,000 feet, if you go to build a 3,000 foot building, it's going to cost you a lot of money on a per square foot basis to build that because there's no economies of scale. So the cost per foot to build a 3,000 foot building is significantly higher than if you were to build, say, a 10,000 foot building. Okay, so with a condominium, it helps that economies of scale. So a condominium office developer can build a 10,000 foot condominium building, split it up into 4 2,500 foot spaces, and then the cost for that 2,500 foot office condo is significantly less than if we built just a 2,500 foot standalone building.
Right.
And that buyer of that 2,500 foot office condo might say, I want to own my space that I occupy, but I don't want to buy a 10,000 foot building and be a landlord to other tenants. I just want what I want.
Sure, sure.
So that's where the office condos or retail condos come into play. And so I think we'll always see a certain amount of that. And it's because it helps that niche of providing space to people. And it could be a building. We have a building in downtown Tacoma where it's a 4-story building and each floor of the building is a different condo. Yeah.
So what are you seeing in the future? I mean, are we going to see more strip malls in the Puget Sound area? What do we see?
Well, that's a good question. I think we'll see additional retail because we've got population growth. So we'll continue to see more apartments, more condos, and more retail to serve that. Space is changing pretty significantly. We've got co-working space, and I don't know if you've talked about that much, but that's a completely different dynamic where people would maybe historically work out of their home will come to a co-working space, not because they can't work at their house, but because they prefer to be around other people and talk about ideas and bounce projects off each other and that sort of thing. So that synergy that's available in the co-working spaces is really what's driving that. And I think we'll see more and more of that in the South Sound. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In regards to leasing and buying options, what kind of considerations should you have around the cannabis industry and what kind of effects that can have for your financing and things like that?
Yeah, that's a tough one because most banks that have federal charters or federal insurance aren't loaning on that. Right. And in fact, if you own an investment property and you have a tenant that's doing that, that could be a problem. Yeah, so until that gets sorted out on the federal level, that'll be an impact.
It's pretty much cash only, huh?
Yeah, or seller financing, as Thomas was talking about, where somebody might finance it for you. As far as the way that's allowed in different areas, though, that's fairly well defined. So in Tacoma, there's certain areas that are zoned for retail, 502, and then also for production and for growing. And so that's fairly well set, so you don't have to worry about buying or leasing a space and then all of a sudden having cannabis appear right next to you because
It's got to be zoned that way.
it's got to be zoned that way, yeah. Yeah.
They seem to be all over the place, though.
They are, yeah. So City of Tacoma has a great map that on their website, and you can pull it up and it just shows you exactly where they can be, and where they can be is typically where they're
Where they are.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. There's not very many properties that allow it and don't have something there. Yeah. And that's, from the investment side, for instance, there's a property in Tacoma they're paying a very, very high rent because it's so specialized. And so the property is for sale at a very, very high cost per foot because
location.
That's the location, and that's the rent they're getting. So a buyer for that would say, I'm willing to take that risk, and I think that's always, there's going to be demand for that, or a buyer might say, well, that kind of scares me, I'd rather not, I'd rather stay away from that.
So how long has this cannabis business been going around? Almost 10 years now? Or no, 5, 6, 7 years?
I don't remember when it
I
started,
don't either.
I believe it started 12.
12, so
2012?
7 years. The government loves their tax dollars. I mean, that's a lot of tax money.
Yeah,
And
I don't think it's going away.
I don't think
It's not going
It's
away.
not going away.
Yeah.
No.
It's not going away.
We might as well start banking them.
Exactly.
Well, and as soon as the federal government comes around, right? Yeah, yeah. And they are doing some things already. Some credit unions and some of the smaller banks are doing 502 business. And there's ways they're dealing with the cash so that they don't have such a high risk, because that's a huge problem for the retailers and for the customers.
Yeah.
Very scary, yeah.
Cash, right?
They have them all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Proctor District, that new, I mean, it's changed over a few years.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's good or bad. What's your opinion with all those tenants coming in, because they're transient? And I know that,
Yeah.
that's an example of Lakewood, you know, initially years ago, they wanted to have all these apartments.
Sure.
And it's transient. And now they're changing their mind and go, hey, we want to be more of a upscale housing, so we want to
Yeah.
build these bigger, beautiful homes.
Sure. So I would say, as an example, in Proctor, I actually live right in that area. And when they built a developer built 2 large apartment complexes, for people that aren't familiar with it, in that neighborhood. And it's got some retail, but then a lot of homes, kind of a residential area. So when the first apartment complex came in, it was a big monstrosity, and most of the neighbors that lived there in homes said, no, thank you, we don't want that, and we're opposed to it. Many of my neighbors. The challenge with that is that what the developer was doing was something that the city of Tacoma actually didn't just allow, but was promoting, attracting. So the city back, I think in maybe '07, changed the zoning to allow larger buildings and taller height limits to encourage just that density, because the density has to go somewhere. So some of my neighbors would say, hey, that's not fair, it should go somewhere else, maybe the Stadium District. And of course the people in the stadium might say, we've already got that, and why don't they go to Proctor? So, you know, unfortunately for the people that live there, if they didn't like that, you know, some of the people moved in after that zoning changed, so that's on them for not noticing that the zoning had changed. Once a property is zoned for something and a developer does it, I don't think we can hold the developer responsible for that. They look like the bad guy. There's no Disney movie where the developer is a good guy, right? The developer's always the bad guy. But in Proctor, whether you like it or not, that's what's there because that's what the city wanted, was the density. So the impact on that neighborhood we'll have more cars on the street, so it'll be harder to find a place to park. But there will also be some great restaurants that'll be there that aren't there right now,
Right.
and some great retail. Yeah.
And what about property value?
I think in general, property values will go up. Yeah. If you look at, it's a much smaller scale than West Seattle, but West Seattle kind of has that community neighborhood feel, and they've seen, again, you don't have to like it, but houses get torn down and they build 3 or 4 story apartments or condos, and there's higher density, and that typically drives values. Yeah.
And plus the rents are pretty high there anyway.
The rents are very high. I can't remember for sure, but I can't remember, it was maybe a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment was $3,500 or $3,800 a month.
That's
And
crazy. Wow.
but you know,
That's the market.
that's the market. Yeah. So I might have that number wrong. Don't quote me on that. But
I believe it.
But it sounds like a house. It sounds like a house payment,
Right,
right?
A
exactly.
nice house payment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
For Tacoma. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Good
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Stuff though.
But I think I haven't noticed any significant. So the first apartment complex is up and running, and it's been there for I think a couple of years now. The second one is finished, and I think it's filling with tenants. And again, they won't have much parking, but that's again by design, because the city and the community wants people to take transit. But I think,
Bikes or scooters.
or bikes or scooters. But I think it'll be good for the area in general.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, it is what it is, you know, I mean, it's, you
Yeah.
can't do anything about it, but.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything else?
No, any more questions? Yeah, I asked a lot of questions, what about you guys?
Yeah, did you guys have anything that I didn't touch on, or?
No, a lot of good information.
Okay.
So, is there anything, any parting words that make us wiser?
No, I'm the wrong person to look to for that.
Do we hang on to our rentals or do we sell them?
Well, I think if you hold on to things, you'll do well. Several, friends of mine that are attorneys that do a lot of estate planning and stuff. One of them said to me, John, he said, I have some people that have more real estate than others, but I don't have any clients that I can think of that have a fair amount of wealth and don't have some real estate.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And again, in our area, it's pretty easy to get bailed out. Even if I were to buy a property that I maybe overpaid, over time, I'll get kind of bailed out of that decision, right? Because people are moving to this area. That's one phenomenon we've touched on before. Not really doesn't fit with this topic today, but in the past, people move to a community based on the people follow the jobs. Okay, so in Ohio, somebody builds a car manufacturing plant or a tire factory or something, and then people move there for that job. And that's the old way. The new way is people move where they want to move.
Yeah.
And the Northwest is a place where people want to move to.
Yeah.
And then the jobs actually follow the people. So we don't think of it that way. When Amazon opens up a new office, we think, oh, Amazon's growing and people are moving for that. It's actually,
They're looking at the talent pool of what's here.
yeah, they're following the people. So if you're in the Northwest and you've got the water and the mountains and the sun 350 days a year, or something like that, then,
We got rain. Yeah,
then yeah.
Yeah.
Liquid sun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of funny, I know we're digressing, but I have some investment properties, and one of them I was really scared of because it was 3 little bungalows on one parcel, which is like an anomaly.
Okay.
It was already grandfathered in, but these bungalows are detached, but they're less than 1,000, maybe 600, 700 square feet. My biggest fear was like, there's no way nobody would rent because they got.
Fine with those, aren't you?
Yeah.
You never have any issues keeping
No, I don't
those
have no issues,
occupied,
but
do you?
my biggest fear was, oh my God, they have all these people coming in with 65-inch screen TVs. How's it going to fit in my house, in the house? But-
Yeah.
And that was the scary part because
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden it flipped. Everybody wants these micro
Little,
homes.
tiny, yep.
They don't
Yeah.
want. They don't want anything.
Right. Efficiency is what
Yeah.
it's all about.
I'm just like,
Yeah.
I knew that was coming.
So,
You're so smart.
there's a development right by UW-T, right? That is micro
Oh, right,
units.
yeah.
Yeah. So they're building it because that's demand, and that developer knows. I think they've done projects in other cities, including Portland, and they know there's a demand for that,
Yeah.
especially near a university.
Yeah, they're going to get filled up. It's
Yeah.
gorgeous. It took them a long time.
Yeah, and the rents are on a monthly basis are fairly low for the tenant, but on a per square foot basis, they're quite high.
Yeah, because you pack them all in.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, thank you so
Okay,
much for your
you
time.
bet.
I really appreciate it. So
Thanks
you
for
so
listening.
much.
All right.